Hello, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, good whatever time of night or day it happens to be, wherever you happen to be. This is Liviana coming to you again with another installment of Republic News. As is so often the case, I will once again be giving you an opinion editorial. So, I've noticed in the mainstream media and even some supposedly independent media recently this claim that the shooting in Las Vegas was the worst or deadliest shooting in U.S. history, or the worst or deadliest shooting in modern U.S. history, period. Neither one of these things is the case. So, let's just talk about some history, shall we? So, in 1893, now some people will say this isn't modern, 1893, but historians certainly would put 1893 in the modern era. But there were photographs of the massacre, in fact, and photographs of one of the Hotchkiss guns which was used, and photographs of some of the soldiers, and so forth and so on. In 1893, there was a massacre at Wounded Knee. The United States Federal Army used 4 Hotchkiss guns, which were like even more deadly and serious than Gatling guns. They used these to massacre as many as 300 Native Americans. This was not during a time of war, and there was no Indian uprising going on. Of the soldiers, 25 were killed and 39 were wounded. Of those 39, 6 were fatally wounded. Of the natives, on the other hand, 150 to 300 were killed. 90 men were killed, 200 women and children were killed, and 51 were wounded, and of those 51, 7 were wounded fatally. But for those who imagine that 1893 was not in the modern era, even though it was, let's fast forward to 1921 and the Greenwood Massacre, also known as the Tulsa Race Riot. In 1921, after the event, the official death toll was 39, but the Red Cross in 1921 gave the total as 300, and this number was confirmed by the Oklahoma Commission on Tulsa Riot Final Report in 2001. There were over 800 non-fatal injuries. So tell me again how what happened in Las Vegas was the worst mass shooting in U.S. history, or even the worst modern shooting in U.S. history. Do the Native Americans not count? Do the African Americans from Tulsa not count? What's the deal here? I am having a great deal of difficulty wrapping my head around this claim. Of course, it could just be clickbait, as we've seen far too often from our mainstream media, and even occasionally from independent media. So, I'd like to go into some greater detail about some things, and I'm going to supply you with some links in the video description later on about murder and homicide rates before and after gun bans in Australia, and the Swiss situation, a gun culture which works, the fact that Swiss men from, I think, age 20 to 40, it used to be 16 to 60, but it seems like it's been changed a bit since then. Do keep their automatic weapons in their homes because they are required to be in the military, which is a reserve force for the most part. And of course, there's been some changes to that since the 90s, I guess, so that most of these soldiers, citizen soldiers, are no longer allowed to keep the ammunition in their homes with their weapons, but they can keep the weapons there. Now, there are some of the soldiers who do get to keep their ammo with their weapons because they're involved in vital defensive infrastructure and so forth. President Obama said weapons of war have no place on our streets, and yet we see our police forces, civilian police forces, being militarized with armored personnel vehicles and tanks and who knows what. In 2014, I guess it was, the state of Massachusetts banned the sale of assault rifles, supposedly. But in Massachusetts from 2007 to 2014, there were 1,301 murders. Of those, only 7 were committed with a rifle, not necessarily an assault rifle, but a rifle, any rifle in general, whereas the other 1,294 were done by other means. The source for this is the FBI Uniform Crime Reports from 2007 to 2014. Actually, however, the sale or transfer of new assault rifles has been illegal nationwide since 1986. Assault rifles refers to one thing and one thing only: machine guns. I suspected that this claim that Massachusetts banned the sale of assault rifles in 2014 was a mistake on someone's part, and it was actually referring to what are sometimes called assault weapons. There is, however, no such thing. It is a purely political term. I will quote from Bruce H. Kobayashi and Joseph E. Olson in the Stanford Law and Policy Review, quote, "Prior to 1989, the term assault weapon did not exist in the lexicon of firearms. It is a political term developed by anti-gun publicists to expand the category of assault rifles," end quote. And of course, by that time, assault rifles or machine guns were already illegal. And in 1986, the sale or transfer of new machine guns to civilians was made illegal and had already been strictly regulated since the National Firearms Act of 1934. In the past decade, so-called assault weapons have been used in only 14 mass shootings. By the middle of April 2016, 1,000 shootings had happened in Chicago alone, and most of those were done with handguns. The federal assault weapons ban lasted from 1994 to 2004. The Columbine High School massacre occurred during that time period. That was 1999. The West Side Middle School shooting was in 1998. The New St. John Fellowship Baptist Church shooting, 1999. Thurston High School shooting, in 1998. Wedgwood Baptist Church shooting, 1998. Mighty Fine Car Wash shooting, 2000. Xerox Engineering Systems shooting, 1999. Atlanta Day Trading shooting, 1999. Edgewater Technology shooting, 2000. These are just a few of many examples of mass shootings which occurred while the federal assault weapons ban was in effect. It did nothing to prevent such crimes. I own a variety of firearms, swords, and even a battle axe, which is not a cheap toy. It is an authentic replica made of oak and steel. I also live on the edge of untamed wilderness where there are bears, cougars, or mountain lions if you prefer that term, various sorts of venomous snakes, including the dread copperhead, which has such effective survival mechanisms that I think it should be made extinct. Personally, I'm sure there are people who would disagree with me, but the thing has almost perfect camouflage. It does not hiss or rattle, but instead plays dead, hoping that you will pass by. Now, obviously, serpents are not malicious or malevolent, but they would like to avoid humans. But, of course, when a human comes into their territory and doesn't notice them, well, a lot of people get bitten by snakes, and a lot of people die because of it. So, as a single woman, and assorted other critters, I mean, there are possum and armadillos which come out and dig up the garden, they dig up the yard. They're a nuisance creature. They're not really a threat to me, but they're a nuisance creature. But when you have an outdoor cat that you keep to try to keep rodents from getting in the house, you know, before they get in the house, the cat should catch them, right? Some of these creatures, raccoons, possums, they will attack your cats. They will kill your cats. So there needs to be some way to deal with these creatures, and you can't put up a fence around your property or your garden or whatever, because these are creatures which will dig under the fence or climb over the fence or jump over the fence. So I live on the edge of this untamed wilderness in what used to be an agrarian community and is rapidly devolving back into untamed wilderness. And as a single woman living alone in such an environment, I would have to be an idiot or naive not to have weapons. There's also a prison not far from here over the mountains, which does occasionally have escapes, and they head in this direction because it's very close to the state line, and this is the direction from there towards the state line, and they want to get out of the state, you know. So I mean, I need it. I need weapons for my safety, for my security. I'm not going to go around and shoot people because of some lame reason, political difference of opinion or religious difference of opinion, or just because I'm psychotic or something. I have been around weapons all my life. I got my first rifle when I was 12. It was a gift from my parents. I have always been taught never point a firearm at anyone unless you intend to use it. I took hunter's safety when I was in ROTC during my undergraduate years. I have quite a bit of training with firearms, and I have a pretty good aim. But I've always been taught to respect firearms, that they're not a toy, and so forth and so on. And the first time I fired a semi-automatic pistol, I realized, whoa, this is not a toy. You know, but I didn't have that until many years later when I bought one for myself. At any rate, I do have one military rifle. It's a relic from either World War I or the Korean War. I'm not sure it would be classed as an assault weapon, although it certainly was used in military assaults. I have never fired it, and I probably never will. It is a very, it has a recoil, and I don't like recoil. It was my father's, and I will keep it because it was my father's. And woe to any fascist asshole who would try to take it from me. If you're willing to look at facts instead of partisan rhetoric, or listen to facts instead of partisan rhetoric, I will offer you some, but I'm also going to talk. So, more and more distraction as some are whipped into fear and sympathy, who then agitate loudly for unnecessary restrictions, while all the while the crippling poverty and shoddy education, the lack of a living wage, the lack of full-time job opportunities, the water poisoned by fracking and lead pipes, our crumbling infrastructure, global warming, religious intolerance, and all the other serious issues we face are pushed aside so that these cries for anti-liberty prohibitions can be pushed more and more. It's a distraction. It's ridiculous, it's irrational, and it's born of ignorance and fear, and it needs to stop because it is a distraction from the actual issues which are important and which are the causes of the violence in the first place. People ignore the evidence which does not support their preconceived ideas. This is known as prejudice and confirmation bias. Again, the Swiss have quite a number of firearms in their country, and they won't give them up. So I'm going to include a link from Time magazine about the Swiss difference, a gun culture that works. I can also include some links to tweets here and there, but one of the things I would want to link is this: screening and background checks don't always weed out the crazies. If you want to check into 3 of the mass shooters in recent past, you'll find that all 3 of them have in common the fact that the government interviewed and or screened them and decided they were not a threat. That includes the shooter at Orlando and a couple of other people. People who are prohibited from owning firearms can get them in spite of their being prohibited from owning one. As Senator Maria Cantwell pointed out Did you know that 61% of perpetrators who killed police officers with guns in Washington state were prohibited from owning guns but were still able to obtain them? You want to repeal the Fifth as well as the Second Amendment? Senator Joe Manchin seems to think that's a good idea, as he tweeted out, due process is what's killing us right now. You know, due process is part of the Fifth Amendment. You know what it says? You know what the due process clause of the Fifth Amendment is? I will quote you the Fifth Amendment. I'm going to leave out a little bit because it's not relevant to the due process clause. But what it says, the relevant bit is, no person shall be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. This is why we have the legal dictum, innocent until proven guilty. You cannot take people's rights away from them based on mere suspicion, at least not under the Constitution. Not everyone on a terror watch list should be there, and some of them can't get off of the list easily, even if they're obviously innocent. I will include here a link to a video about the 8-year-old boy, and I think he's a little older than that now, Mikey Hicks, about sharing his name with a suspected terrorist, and he's, as of the time that video was made at least, which I believe was last year or the year before last, he was still on the terror list and couldn't get off. So, I mean, is this terror list supposed to be getting rid of due process alone would still not be enough. Some say we should extend this prohibition to anyone who has ever been suspected and cleared of potential future criminal acts. What are you talking about, Jova? Well, there was an article from the New York Times last year in which, and I quote, the Democratic legislation sponsored by Senator Dianne Feinstein of California would seek to prevent individuals on the government's terror watch list from purchasing guns on the recommendation of the Justice Department alone. Ms. Feinstein unsuccessfully proposed a similar measure last year after 14 people were killed by an Islamic extremist couple in San Bernardino, California. The legislation she is now proposing goes even further, covering not just people on the watch list at the time of purchase, but anyone who had been on the list in the preceding 5 years. The Orlando gunman, Omar Mateen, had been on the list but was removed after an FBI investigation turned up no evidence that he was plotting any crimes. End quote. So, Senator Feinstein thinks we should just get rid of the rule of law altogether and let the government do whatever the hell it wants. How about no? How about we stop putting Band-Aids on people who have the flu and instead give them an antiviral? That is, how about we treat the causes of violence in society rather than attempt ineffective and anti-liberty prohibitions which don't even address the symptoms? You want to fix this challenge? Fix the socioeconomic ills of our society. Stop blowing over half of all tax monies on the military and stop giving over $2 billion a year to Israel no matter what they do. Make them fight their own wars, or at least abide by international human rights standards. Stop toppling governments sitting on top of oil that some petroleum company wants, and instead start investing real-time money and effort into alternative, sustainable energy sources. Start promoting education and reform in all of the "my religion is the one true and only way" cults out there, including not only Islamofascism, but also Protestant fundamentalism. Raise minimum wage to $25 an hour because $15 isn't really enough in some places. Cap pharmaceutical prices. In fact, institute price controls across the board. Give us single-payer universal health care. Get rid of right-to-work laws. Get corporate money out of politics. Improve education. Start paying teachers more than police officers and make education as good in low-income areas as it is in wealthier areas. Repair our crumbling infrastructure and put people to work doing it. Give people some hope by giving them useful and beneficial jobs like that, not bullshit jobs. Get rid of predatory loans. Crack down on venture capitalism and risky bank practices. Make the rich pay their fair share of taxes. Stop militarizing the police. Have all police shootings investigated thoroughly by independent investigators and actually punish those who have abused authority. These are the issues we face. These are the causes of violence in society. The tool is just a tool. Or are airplanes now in need of being prohibited because of the attacks of the 11th of September 2001? Of course not. I'm not a right-winger. I'm not a fundamentalist of any kind, nor a follower of any Abrahamic religion. I don't believe in an apocalyptic religion. I don't look forward to an end of the world. I'm not a social conservative or a social reactionary. I'm not a Republican. I'm not a member of the Libertarian Party nor an objectivist. Neither am I a Democrat. I'm a Green. I'm a progressive left libertarian. But I'm not part of what some on the right refer to as the regressive left. I don't support draconian overreactions which deprive the majority of law-abiding citizens of rights because of the acts of a few. I'm going to say some things here which will likely be unpopular with some of you. I hope you will nevertheless listen and consider what I have to say. We have this thing, as I mentioned earlier, called the Fifth Amendment, which says, among other things, no person shall be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. That's one of the reasons we have the legal dictum innocent until proven guilty. Being suspected of something is therefore insufficient cause to deprive a person of his or her constitutional rights. It was pretty easy to get on a terror watch list while W was president. If you were a subversive liberal in the eyes of the administration, they could put you on that list. It's notoriously difficult to get off such a list, however, if you can even find out you're on it. And being suspected is now going to be considered justification for depriving a person of liberty, then why were Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump not taken out of the election? Because they were both being investigated for crimes which, if they were found guilty, should have disqualified both of them for public service. Orlando was not about firearms, and neither was Las Vegas. 9/11 was not about airplanes either, nor was Oklahoma City about fertilizer. The tool is not the issue. They will find other tools. No, Orlando was about fundamentalist and specifically Islamist. Not Islamic, but Islamist. That is, Islamofascism, not Islam itself. Islamist terrorism. The shooter yelled, Allahu Akbar, as he shot people. You can verify that if you check the news. Reform and education is the only policy which will end that kind of insanity, that kind of extremism, that kind of zealotry. And it needs to be aimed not only at Islamofascists, but also at Protestant fundamentalists and Catholic credalists and any other sort of dogmatic asswits who believe their way is the one true and only way. Every time some nut goes on a shooting spree, partisan Democrats start pissing themselves and crying for gun control in some form or another. And what we need to be looking at are the motivations of the shooter and not the tools. Sometimes partisan Democrats manage to get whatever damned fool restriction they're howling for passed. It doesn't resolve anything, as we see the next time some nut goes on a shooting spree. So partisan Democrats start pissing themselves and whining again for still more restrictions on the freedoms of law-abiding citizens. And if their prohibition passes, it again doesn't resolve anything. Another nut goes on a shooting spree, and they go through the same shit again. Don't tell me they're not talking about disarming the citizens, because that will be the final law their bunch pushes on this matter if this trend continues. We already see, as a response to Las Vegas shooting, people howling that we should get rid of all guns now. But then we would have people using other means to kill people. Even with all the restrictions on what you can and cannot buy, it is still ridiculously easy to manufacture an explosive device or an incendiary device, and those can kill more people than a firearm can. A person armed with a knife in an environment where nobody else has any sort of weapon is just as dangerous and deadly as someone with a firearm. They may not be able to kill quite as quickly, but they can still kill, and if no one else has any means of defending themselves, hey, who's going to stop them? So, then partisan Democrats will be pushing for knife control. They have this in the United Kingdom, knife and sword control, and the violent resort to screwdrivers, hammers, chunks of masonry, concrete, rock, whatever they can get their hands on. Ban those too? Ridiculous, you say. Yeah, all of it is ridiculous. It won't fix anything for the people, but it will make government ever bolder with their militarized police. We already have police shooting unarmed civilians, and their skin color does not matter either. But of course it is ridiculous. The whole damned thing is ridiculous because it's not the tool which is good or bad. It's just a tool. It cannot in and of itself do any harm to anyone, nor can it in and of itself do any good for anyone. There has to be agency, an acting subject. What causes a person to act in such a way? What prevents others from acting in such a way? That is where we need to look for solutions. And do you know anything about the Orlando shooter? Do you know that he was a professional security guard, that he had all of the licenses he needed to buy firearms, that he had passed background checks? Ban all firearms for every private citizen? Do you really think that would work? Really? Because it doesn't work. It really doesn't. And I will provide you with some statistics from crimeresearch.org and Mint Press News in the video description. These truths are inconvenient, aren't they? Finding an actual solution is so much more challenging, isn't it? But don't we want an actual solution instead of feel-good overreactions which won't effect the change we seek? Some of you have waxed nostalgic about the good old days when we had the assault weapons ban, which ended in 2004. To be precise, it lasted from 1994 to 2004. I've already given the following data in this video, but it bears repeating. The Columbine High School massacre occurred during that period. It was 1999. West Side Middle School shooting was in 1998. New St. John Fellowship Baptist Church shooting, 1999. Thurston High School shooting, 1998. Wedgwood Baptist Church shooting, 1998. Mighty Fine Car Wash shooting, 2000. Xerox Engineering Systems shooting, 1999. Atlanta Day Trading shooting, 1999. Edgewater Technology shooting, 2000. Again, as I said before, these are just a few examples of many mass shootings which occurred during that 10-year period while the federal assault weapons ban was in effect. Your precious assault weapons ban didn't help to prevent any of these mass shootings. Now let's talk about assault weapons and such things. What exactly is an assault weapon? As I quoted before, from Bruce H. Kobayashi and Joseph E. Olson in the Stanford Law and Policy Review, quote, prior to 1989, the term assault weapon did not exist in the lexicon of firearms. It is a political term developed by anti-gun publicists to expand the category of assault rifles, end quote. And of course, by that time, as I said, assault rifles or machine guns were already illegal. In 1986, the sale or transfer of new machine guns to civilians was made illegal and had already been strictly regulated since the National Firearms Act of 1934. A lot of people seem to think that the Orlando shooter used an AR-15. I'm not really sure why. Perhaps it's because partisan Democrats can only conceive of that weapon as the one used by shooters of this sort, and the mainstream media went with the idea that it was an AR-15. In fact, however, the shooter used in Orlando used a Sig Sauer MCX, which is actually a lot more useful and a lot more deadly than an AR-15. But let's talk about the AR-15 since so many people seem to be so obsessed with it. If you were ever in the military, you likely believe that you know something about this weapon. It is a civilian version of the M16. I myself have fired the military version, taken it apart, cleaned it, and put it back together again as part of my military training when I was in ROTC back in my undergraduate days. The AR-15 does not fire 3 rounds with one squeeze of the trigger like the M16, which is the military version of the weapon. It fires a single round with each squeeze of the trigger. It is a semi-automatic, not an automatic. It's 39 inches long and weighs 8 pounds. In terms of firepower, it's not a particularly dangerous weapon relative to other weapons, of course. It fires a .223 caliber shell. Someone with training in the weapon and skill in shooting can fire about 60 rounds per minute, max. Contrast that with a full auto rifle, which can fire as many as 1,000 rounds in 1 minute. The AR-15 looks scary. It has a military appearance, but in all honesty, it's not much different from a .22 long rifle, which isn't particularly dangerous or deadly. In fact, the AR-15 is far less lethal than many other firearms. Its range is 400 to 600 yards. Popular hunting rifles with a more powerful caliber shell have a range of 1,000 yards. The AR-15 is not powerful enough to reliably put down deer-sized or larger game, contrary to the claims of the National Rifle Association, which is the real reason it's illegal to use an AR-15 for hunting in most states. In the past decade, so-called assault weapons have been used in only 14 mass shootings. By the middle of April 2016, 1,000 shootings had happened in Chicago alone in 2016, and most of those were done with handguns, and probably a sizable portion of those were done by the police. So tell me again about how an assault weapons ban would make us so much safer. So now how about we look for the actual causes of violent crime in this country? These are socioeconomic in nature, not mechanical. For one thing, you have religions which teach intolerance and hatred. For another, you have a shitty educational system, which is even shittier in low-income areas. Then you have that low-income situation itself due in part to the poor quality of education, but also due to lack of employment opportunities and the reality of the situation that the current minimum wage is not a living wage. Plus all the right-to-work states where labor unions have little to no bargaining power because the bosses will simply hire scabs if their employees go on strike. Working conditions are often unsafe and unsanitary. Medical costs are ludicrous and inconsistent. Medical treatment is often difficult to get even with insurance due to distance and availability. Debt is a huge issue. In many urban areas and quite a few rural areas, the only hope for making enough money to live on is to turn to the manufacture and or distribution of addictive drugs like crystal methamphetamine, a drug which itself produces a psychosis characterized by paranoia and delusions, which can, as you might expect, encourage violent behavior. And of course, manufacturing or distributing such substances is illegal, and those involved are one of the biggest segments of the population involved in violent crime. These are the issues which are causes, and these therefore are the issues which must be addressed if we hope to decrease violence of all types. Getting rid of violence isn't possible. It's going to happen, but passing more gun control laws is not going to do anything to decrease violence, neither instantly nor in the long run, as I've shown above with examples of mass shootings, as I've shown earlier with examples of mass shootings which occurred during the federal assault weapons ban, which you have touted as desirable with the rose-colored glasses of nostalgia. And tell me again how the Paris shooters got their weapons when they performed their massacre at the Charlie Hebdo offices, which those weapons are illegal to be sold in France. They have absolute total gun control there. How did they get their weapons? Prohibition has never worked. It doesn't matter if it's alcohol or marijuana or guns or whatever, firearms, assault weapons. It only makes organized crime and terror more wealthy and more powerful, and people still get whatever it is that has been prohibited. Addressing these issues, which I have listed, however, will decrease violence, not overnight, but in the long run. Think about it rationally and honestly. And I know there are some people who are speculating that the weapons which the shooter in Las Vegas used were all legal, semi-automatic rifles. As far as I know, we haven't been told what kind of weapons he had, other than that he had 10 rifles, and they were said to be long rifles, 10 long rifles in the hotel room with him. So there are people who are talking about the little Gatling gun thingy that you can crank, that you can put on the attached to the gun, so that it will automatically press the trigger for you, depress the trigger for you repeatedly, and turns your AR-15 into a Gatling gun. But again, we don't know that the shooter had an AR-15. We don't know that he had a semi-automatic weapon. He could have had a fully automatic weapon. So, this speculation, as far as I know, we haven't been told the exact weapons that he had or how he was able to fire automatic weapon fire into the crowd. Unless the information came out while I was sleeping yesterday evening, or has come out sometime in this night, before now. It's near dawn here, so and I may have overlooked it because I haven't been sitting on top of this. But at any rate, addressing the issues I have listed will be a good start to decreasing violence, not just gun violence, but all violence, and not overnight. There's no magic pill, but in the long run. I'm asking you to think about it honestly and rationally, and I thank you for your consideration of what I have said. So, until next time, have fun, but stay safe. I'm going to beam up to my B11 Stormbird now and warp out. As always, if you like what I have to say, hit that like button and subscribe. If you like what I say, what I do here at YouTube, on my channel, and or at my publication, The Progressive Flame, on Medium, please consider becoming my patron on Patreon. And until next time, may the Great Mother Raptor guard you in the shelter of her wings. This is Liviana signing off.